Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar co-hosted by the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy's Innovation Policy Lab and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. I'm Josh O'Kane, technology reporter for the Globe and Mail. Welcome to my home office, where a bunch of exercise equipment and unwrapped gifts are hidden artfully out of the frame. I'm very glad to be here. It feels a bit full circle for me because one of the last real life events I was able to attend prior to the pandemic was at the Monk School in February discussing intellectual property and Ontario's economy. And I'm glad to be back today in a moderating position. Today, we're going to be talking about inclusive innovation during and after COVID. These are big issues. We only have an hour today, so I'm going to get right to it. But before we do, I want to remind you that we are inviting questions from the audience, which we'll be discussing towards the end of the webinar. Please write to us in Zoom's Q&A field in the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many of these questions as we can towards the end of the webinar. I'm going to introduce our panelists today. I'm going to start with Sue Helper. She's the Carleton Professor of Economics at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University and co-director of the Program on Innovation, Equity, and the Future of Prosperity at CFAR. Next up, we have Anjum Sultana. She's the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications for YWCA Canada. Welcome, Anjum. Next, we have Danny Bresnitz, the co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and the co-director of the Program on Innovation, Equity, and the Future of Prosperity at CFAR. And lastly, we have Daniel Monroe, who's a senior fellow at the Innovation Policy Lab at the Munk School and a research advisor at the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. So I'm going to actually start with you, Daniel. Let's open up as broadly as possible. What is inclusive innovation and why does it matter?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So we have a pretty diverse audience from what I understand. And I mean that in a number of senses, including, intellectual and professional background. So it's probably useful to get everyone on the same page in terms of understanding what we mean by innovation and what we mean by inclusive innovation. So start with innovation, right? As I think about it, it's the application of knowledge to develop new or improved products, services, processes, marketing methods, and things like that, with a view to generating value, whether that's economic, social, or both. And that value, it can be higher revenues, growth, improved productivity, more environmentally sustainable ways of doing things, or health improvements. So simply, the key there is that innovation generates value, right? And that's why it is important, right? Because it's the central way, if not a central way, if not the primary way, by which we improve productivity, improve economic growth, and improve people's lives, right? So that's a sort of conventional standard way of thinking about innovation and why it matters. But what about, as you say, inclusive innovation, which is the theme of this conversation? Well, as I think about it, innovation is inclusive when it meets three criteria. First of all, there's a participation criteria, right? When there are good opportunities for all people to participate, most notably in education and employment, but also say as entrepreneurs, if people choose, then that is one criterion of inclusive innovation. Then there's a distribution criteria, right? Innovation is inclusive when the benefits and harms of innovation are fairly or more equitably distributed. And that includes income, wealth, health and well-being, as well as access to the products and services that innovation produces. And then third, and I think this is one that I think people, when they hear it, they realize that it's important, but they often sort of neglect it when they talk about inclusive innovation, and that's empowerment, right? That is, innovation is inclusive when people are empowered to contribute to decisions about the speed and direction of innovation in their workplaces and in their communities more generally. And finally, so why does this matter, right? Why does inclusive innovation matter? It matters for two reasons. It matters for reasons of fairness, right? I mean, an economy and a society that excludes and disempowers is simply unjust. But it also matters for innovation and growth. And I think we'll talk about this over the course of the hour, I think, that there's a growing body of evidence which indicates that societies achieve better innovation and growth where inequality is not too high and where more people are able to contribute as workers, consumers, entrepreneurs, and citizens. So that's how I think about inclusive innovation, and maybe others do as well, but maybe they have slightly different versions of that.
Yeah, does anyone else want to come in with their definition of inclusive innovation and how you see it unfolding during or after COVID?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question. I think right now, top of mind for many people across Canada is the vaccine. This is something where we're seeing the first person in the UK get the vaccine later this month. We're anticipating vaccines in our country. But that is a form of innovation, right? To think in the year that we first anticipated or interacted with this COVID-19 pandemic, we actually have a vaccine, something that typically takes 10 years, 15 years to actually create. But who gets to benefit from that vaccine? So right now, coming from a health equity background, thinking about, is this something that's going to be accessible to people all across the different geographies of Canada? In the north, I know recently Premier of Manitoba was under fire for some of the comments that were made around distribution of the vaccine. I think also about who created the vaccine. Behind it was a Turkish-Swedish couple, immigrants to that country who helped to, create this life-saving contribution to societies across the globe. So I think when it comes to innovation, it's again what Daniel was mentioning, who gets to participate, who benefits. But I think another aspect of this is who feels like they can actually bring their whole selves to work, right? Or their whole selves to different sectors. And that psychological safety and that inclusion piece, I think, is so important. And I think, post-COVID, there's going to be a lot of challenges to people's labor market participation, but I think at the core of it is we're going to realize we need all hands on deck. So reducing barriers is going to be very key to unlocking the innovative potential of all people in Canada.
Danny or Sue, do you want to weigh in? Okay, well,
wonderful definition. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, I said I think it's a wonderful definition.
Okay.
We can
Well, in that case, perhaps Sue, I had a question for you then. Let's talk about jobs in innovation and in the economy. What is the importance of good jobs in inclusive innovation?
Well, one thing I think is important, I really like Dan's definition that, I think empowering people not just around the pace of innovation, but the nature of innovation is really important, both as a end in itself and also because it can increase the, as Daniel said, the overall pace of economic growth. So I've been looking at digitization, digital transformation in manufacturing. So bringing automation, robots, data analytics to factory floors. And there's two ways that companies can do this. One is they have an algorithm that substitutes for judgment. So one company, and so just to give an example of two firms, they both do stamping for the automotive industry. One put a bunch of sensors on its presses. If it sensed a fault, the machine would stop and the worker had to go get a supervisor before anything could happen. There was no judgment, nothing. Another one also put sensors on the machine, but then trained the worker to do some simple maintenance to figure out what the problem was and empower the worker. And so then the job actually became more skilled and higher paid, whereas in the first case, it became less skilled and ripe for at least no wage increase. So I think this view of who can participate in the innovation, because in this second case, this worker that's operating the press is actually seeing the data from the press, using that to make improvements. So thinking that you have to be an engineer or something to make an innovation is very limiting.
All right, and going back to you, Danny, I'd love to sort of zoom out on a wider scope again and talk about sort of, do innovations or technology more broadly, do you believe they sort of enable and include or disable and exclude inherently?
So as we say, in the long term, we are all dead. But if you look from the Industrial Revolution till today, it's very clear that they include more than they exclude. The problem that we have today is that the way we are practicing innovation, especially in the reach world, it's create inequality if it's successful. And I'll give you an example. If your main modes of doing innovation, you forget about what Sue talked about, you forget about others, and you really focus just on startups, and your model of startups is venture capital. That means that, first of all, the people that are allowed to be included are R&D engineers from your top universities. So people who are already quite well off. Then they get a lottery ticket to a company. If the company is successful, especially in Canada, and I will not name names, it will be sold for a lot of money. And who gets that money? The VCs and the R&D engineers and the lawyers. Very little jobs are created. So if this is your mode of innovation, you actually then create more and more inequality. And you can see it in the two places that we dream about, we meaning Canadian. We somehow think that Silicon Valley is a good model for innovation, or Israel. We completely forget that those are two of the most unequal places on earth. So I would say that the innovation actually enables, as a matter of fact, just looking at us, at the panel, without an innovation called glasses, at least 3 of us will be disabled without work. The other 2 might, but I just don't know whether you have contact lenses or not.
I'm wearing contact lenses right now.
So 4 of us would be at best on welfare, unable to do what we do now because I wouldn't be able to see the screen. That's what innovation does when it does it well. So the real question for all of us is how we create an innovation policy, where we channel innovation and how we diffuse it, and who is allowed to participate in all those decisions, from making the innovation to using the innovation. And unfortunately, I think that in the last 20, 25 years, we fell in love with the wrong model, and it's time we change it.
I would just add to that, Josh, if I can, if you go back to, when I was laying out this definition of innovation, I emphasized the importance of generating value, right? There's a lot, to build on something that Danny said, there are a lot of initiatives that are called innovation in society today that, again, they look like innovation. They seem to generate value for some people, but in some cases, they're really just reshuffling value around, right? So there's a debate to be had about whether certain apps that say facilitate ride sharing or that facilitate food delivery actually generate value, or whether they just shuffle it around from, say, conventional taxi cabs to gig workers who are in more precarious positions, or whether the revenues that are generated through those things actually benefit communities at large, rather than just the owners and the VCs who develop these things. I say it's a debate to be had, but I think it's important to acknowledge that we're talking about generating value through innovation, how that value is generated, who gets to participate, and how it's distributed at the both within and at the back end of the process itself.
And I think that's a great jumping off point then to perhaps move to our next segment, where I want to talk a little bit about the relationships between innovation and inequality and inclusion. And Sue, I'd like to turn to you first for this one. How does, in your research and from the literature that you've reviewed, how does innovation affect inequality and vice versa?
Well, it depends a lot on the nature of the innovation and how it's implemented. And so I think it's really important that innovation doesn't just fall from the sky. And I think you can, and actually, if you think about these digital innovations that I just talked about, you could actually see them increasing equality by making all jobs having all jobs be have access to innovation and making improvements, or you could see them increasing inequality by making some people essentially drones and prisoners of algorithms that they don't understand how they were created and have no ability to change. So I think often we speak about innovation as this force from outside that we have no control over. And I think that's actually dangerous. And if we actually thought about in our national innovation strategies, putting job quality, the various aspects of Daniel's really great definition, if we thought about putting those into the missions of our various R&D agencies, that might lead to some very different sorts of innovations being developed. And right now, a lot of the goal of innovation is simply to replace workers. Along the way, you may find some positive impacts, but the goals are not inclusivity generally.
Okay. Danny or Daniel, do you have any sort of insights to build on top of that?
Sure. I want to give you a concrete example. We are now talking on Zoom, and we're talking about the internet. So on one side, this is unbelievably equalizing. No matter where you are in the world, you can now tune in to a webinar in the University of Toronto, MIT, University of British Columbia, and get the same contact and education and access that otherwise would have to be in Toronto or in Boston or in California. The same goes if you look actually to syllabuses, access to articles, papers, data, books, okay? On one side, highly equalizing. On the other side, we just had COVID. If you have no access to the internet, you now cannot get even basic education in Canada. Forget about other parts of the world. So it's both ways. And the real question is, how do you maximize the good and minimize, or at least counter, the bad? The second thing, and that people should think about if you want to create more equality is, and we talked about it, who gains from innovation, okay? And how do you incentivize innovation? Do you create a lottery system through the stock exchange? Or this is a slow growth of productivity shared by both workers and the rest? And the last but not least, and we should talk about it at some point, innovation means different skills. And many times in the beginning of innovation, those that have the skills to really utilize it are a very small group. Technically, it will be called skill bias technological change, right? Those are the things that you have to counter for. And I think Dan and others have a lot more to say about skills than I do.
So, okay, so since Danny prompted me, well, let me give a quick example, but I'm actually going to offer this example with the aim of bringing Anjum and her expertise into this as well. So, like, take the experience of high-skilled immigrants to Canada, right? We do in Canada a pretty good job of attracting immigrants with high levels of education and skills to the country. But the experience of immigrants with high skills once they arrive is characterized by, difficulties with credential and experience recognition, difficulties sort of matching their skills to jobs, and they tend to experience low wages that persist throughout their careers. Now, as I read it, that would be, it's bad for those people whose talents are being neglected, especially since they were, attracted to Canada with the expectation of, leading a good middle-class life, as we like to say. But it's also bad for Canada's economy, which could probably benefit from a better use of their skills. But I don't want to say too much more than that. Maybe Anjum wants to add to that based on her experience.
Yeah, thanks so much, Daniel. And I will say this was something, again, in the pandemic we saw. We have many people in this city, but also across the country, who are internationally trained medical professionals. And so in the fight against COVID, we were starting to see some provinces, namely British Columbia, and there were some conversations in Ontario as well, around how do we actually fast track people's applications into licensure around participating and supporting the fight against COVID. But there are still a lot of barriers and they still have not been resolved. And I think, for a lot of folks, they feel disheartened, they feel excluded, and then that ability to contribute year after year diminishes, right? And so we have incredible people that come to this country from all around the world, their expertise that we could benefit from, but we're not able to realize that full potential. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about, in the aftermath of this pandemic, some of the communities that have been the hardest hit are women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people, as well as racialized folks. And so this is something even prior to the pandemic, we were thinking about how do we actually support diverse communities in accessing STEM, for example. I think this becomes even more important when we think about the sectors that have been the hardest hit: retail, food services, hospitality, accommodations. We don't know if those jobs are going to come back. So there is this entire cadre of workers. We have to figure out a way to pivot. And I think, artificial intelligence and many of the, high innovative fields could be a place where they could transition, but what supports are in place? So one thing I just wanted to flag for folks is the fall economic statement. Last week it came out. Within it, there was a strategic innovation fund. And what we did not see, though, and what our organization was hoping to see, was a gender-specific angle to it, or an equity-specific angle. So that's a missed opportunity, right? Where we know that there are historical barriers to accessing funds like this, but what provisions were made to kind of address that? So I'll leave it there, but suffice to say, when we don't include everyone's perspective, we all suffer.
I think that's a really great observation, because at the fall economic statement, there were numerous references, and I believe even a checklist towards the end regarding how things would fit in towards a feminist economic recovery. And Anjum, I know you've literally written just very recently a report on sort of the idea of sort of a feminist approach to the economy, and particularly with a lot of focus on intersectionality and looking at how people may be left behind as intersectionality sort of applies to them. And I'm curious if you might be able to shed a little bit of light on how your research might apply if you could sort of lead us through the sort of how your research might apply to the situation of recovery, looking through the lens of not just the fall economic statement, but sort of looking beyond COVID more broadly.
Yeah, so I guess what I can start off with saying is that because of who was most impacted, we can't use our traditional measures. And so the traditional stimulus funding that we might have done in previous recessions may not apply, and we won't get the full benefits if we just use that traditional approach. And so the plan itself kind of makes the argument that we have never experienced something quite like this. So we need a new playbook, and that's what the Feminist Recovery Plan offers. I will say a place that, we can start to look at for innovation, but also just in terms of addressing the severe gaps in Canada, is around the care economy. That is a place that we see as being pandemic proof in many ways, because, our organization's 150 years old. So unfortunately, this is not the first pandemic we've experienced. We experienced the 1917 flu. And what was true then and what's true now is care is consistently required. And we are seeing, for example, where were the hardest hit communities, long-term care homes? What innovation has been happening in that space, for example? We also talk a lot about decent work and also supporting entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds. So again, making some concrete investments, but also some public procurement changes in policy to invest in different types of businesses and different types of organizations. So that's a bit of some of the different things we explored. And I think the last thing I'll mention is, and I think this is quite important, is around, that inclusive piece that Danielle talked about. We can't really have innovation in its fullest extent if we don't tackle systemic racism, if the communities that have been historically marginalized are not supported in realizing their full potential. So that's something that needs to be part of this conversation as well.
What do you think that Canada could do to try to eradicate systemic racism in these decisions that are being made at such high government levels?
Yeah, so one example, so there's an action plan on women in the economy that the fall economic statement talked about. Who gets to sit on that task force? Is it, looking at women majority sectors or sectors that are disproportionately, racialized, for example? Who gets to make the decisions, right? To Danny's point, right? I think that's part of it, but then also distribution of resources. So, it was promising to see a Black entrepreneurship fund and strategy, and there's a similar one for women's entrepreneurship. But I think, we need to really see tangible differences on the ground. So I would say part of it is also changing what we measure. The Minister of Finance talked about guardrails in the fall economic statement, total number of hours worked, employment rate. Are we looking at income inequality as part of that calculus? Not right now, but that's what I would like to see.
So let's zoom out a little bit. I think this is a great opportunity, sort of a broad discussion is, how are Canada and other countries doing when it comes to inclusive innovation? Andrew, you sort of, I don't know if you have any further thoughts regarding that before we open to other panelists, but I'm curious.
I'll jump in later. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna put everybody else on the spot. Danny, Daniel, Sue?
I can talk about, at the risk of this being a promo for some work that I'm doing with the Innovation Policy Lab and the Brookfield Institute. I'm working with those two groups on something we're calling the Inclusive Innovation Monitor, right? Which is essentially like a data-rich tool that brings both these innovation and inclusion lenses, as I defined it earlier, together to monitor performance. Both Canada compared to other countries on, a series of metrics around innovation, a series of metrics around inclusion, Canada to other countries, but also over time to get a better sense of how we're doing. And also to sort of advance the conversation about how innovation and inclusion interact, right? There are a number of sort of existing innovation report cards globally and in Canada. There are a number of initiatives that track equity, diversity, and inclusion, but nothing to my knowledge that puts those two together and tries to understand, how they interact. And, what it's showing, we're going to release this thing in January, and what it shows is in some ways, nothing that's surprising to anybody who's familiar with the innovation policy world, nothing that's surprising to anybody who's in the equity, diversity, inclusion world, but that might be sort of novel or important to hear if you haven't been paying attention to the other discourse, right? And that is that, Canada is neither as innovative nor as inclusive or egalitarian as it needs to be, right? Let me give you just one example. Take education employment of the education employment experience of racialized people in Canada. So, with the exception of one or two identities on which data are collected by Statistics Canada, racialized people are more likely than non-racialized people to hold a university or college degree, and they're more likely to be employed in what we call technology-intensive occupations, those that are associated with the leading edge of innovation. But, and here's the big thing, this is where we have to worry about systemic barriers, racialized people in those tech occupations tend to be paid less than non-racialized people, and they're less likely to feel empowered to contribute ideas to support innovation and business strategy in the companies that they work for, right? Like that's a remarkable gap. Higher educated, more likely to participate in those sectors, and yet paid less and feel less empowered. That's exactly the kind of suspicious sort of a situation which we need to worry about and try to address systemic racism.
Sue, I'm curious what your thoughts are in viewing Canada versus the United States on this front.
Many of us in the US look to Canada as a bastion of sanity, I guess, and kind of a moderation in good ways. And I guess I think there's two things that I think have governed maybe policies in this area, in both inclusion and innovation in the US. One is that there is a trade-off between equity and efficiency, and that if you really want efficiency or innovation, you have to give huge payouts to innovators. And so maybe I'll talk about that one first. I've just been working with MIT Work of the Future project that just released a report. And one of the things that one of the co-chairs, David Otter, has said is that US is actually not getting a very good return on its inequality, that we have high levels of inequality, particularly when you look at the difference between the top 1% and the bottom 99%. But we're not really growing that fast compared to the rest of the world. So I think we need, new models, and so this, drawing on the skills of all people can help us. The second thing is the inclusion strategy has really focused on getting underrepresented folks and women, giving them opportunities to participate in the market economy. And so we have almost as a metric, the participation, labor force participation by women. And, and work really means market work. So, taking care of children, that's not work in our official definitions. And I think, in COVID, we're seeing that this is really a problem when the ability to, outsource household production is less. You can't send your kids off to school. The daycare doesn't work so much that this burden falls on women. And so, you might think about a different approach to innovation and to recognizing that, advancing the market isn't necessarily the only thing you could do. There's other kinds of things you could do. We could take some of our innovation gains in terms of less market work. So the US has been really bad on this, that our weekly hours of work are high by world standards, and our vacation time is really low, and there's not really much family leave. I guess I think that these two directions of actually building on ways that you could have innovation that promotes equality, and also thinking about valuing other forms of work. So the care economy, much of which doesn't happen, is not mediated by markets. Both those things could be important ways forward, I think, in the US especially.
So I would like to follow up with two things. First of all, as we have done this research, the whole group of CFAR, and especially Sue and myself and Amos, who's also a co-director, and Dan, what we found out that we talk a lot, but there's actually not systemic collection of data. And here I would like to celebrate, sorry for the slight promotion, but also celebrate the Brookfield Institute and Dan, especially, and the IPL. We're trying to do that, to finally have a systemic view going back of what is happening instead of talking in anecdotes. And there's no such thing. And partly because the policymakers and the academics who care about equality are in one corner, and those who care about innovation are in another corner, and they just don't like to talk to each other. But the other thing that we have done, and here is my co-author Amos Zahavi, we came up with a concept of what we call distribution sensitive innovation policy. So can you actively think about innovation policies that are successful, meaning, and I'm now talking about economics, not other values, are effective in growing the economic value, but are also distribution sensitive. So if you do them right, you at least not increase inequality, hopefully actually increase equality. And the way we looked at it for, now basically is to look at groups that are marginalized in the society and thinking, if I want to help that group, so one of them will be regions, which is very prominent in Canada, if you think about our country. The other will be racialized groups and minorities and women, what we call ascriptive minorities. The other will be the disabled. And the other will be difference in skill level. And we looked at all four of them and tried empirically to go throughout the world and see whether there are innovation policies that aim specifically to solve that issues. And we find several of them. But what is really interesting politically, none of them were created or funded in order to deal with inequality. They were all, but all of those that managed to get funded either because somebody managed to say something economically valuable. For example, it is really, really stupid to discount all females in the economy. We're losing 50% of brains. Nothing about the inequality. We are losing taxpayers' money. The second, that even when those innovation policy are conducted, the wrong metrics are being collected. So, for example, if you want to help SMEs and create more jobs for workers with not a lot of education, one of the metrics you should collect is how many jobs you're created. Instead, the measure that we are collecting is how innovating are those companies and what are the revenues after they got money. So we don't even know whether they work. With regards to Canada, we are not doing a lot of those kind of distribution sensitive innovation policies. I would urge us to start doing that. And I would urge all of us to start thinking about innovation policy also in terms of, if I'm successful with this innovation policy, what will be the distribution impact? Do I like them? If I don't like them, what can I do to that policy not to reach that stage?
And this actually seems to dovetail rather well with Antrim's research on the feminist recovery. And I'm curious, Antrim, if, sort of building on what Danny was saying, how you sort of imagine the feminist recovery playing specifically into the idea of inclusion and growth, and in particular, on the side from that, about what kind of data we should be collecting to allow us as a society to be more inclusive in our decision making.
Yeah, and I'll even say, as I was writing with my co-author, Carmina Ravanira, who is based actually at the Institute for Gender and the Economy at the University of Toronto, so well connected to this world, it was really hard to get the data pieces that we really needed to really examine just the devastation of the economic and social fallout of this pandemic. Where we could find some gender data, but I will say again, it was in the binary, so women, men, not really understanding what was the impact on gender diverse people. So that was a big gap. Similarly, around racial lines, around people with disabilities, there were severe data gaps. And I think for any situation, when you're trying to address a concern, this wicked challenge of inequality, if we don't actually have data on who is impacted and the baseline, and then we do interventions out, we won't actually know what the impact of that was, right? And we won't be able to compare, and we won't be able to scale up practices and policies that generate inclusion and generate more inclusive economies. I wanted to also talk a bit about the social innovation world. So I come from the philanthropic world. And a few weeks ago, actually, there was a landmark paper that was put out by Black philanthropists in Black communities. And it looked at the fact that Black-led organizations and Black-serving organizations only receive 0.07% of philanthropic funding over the last number of years. And I can perhaps put it in the chat, that report, but that does a disservice in terms of investing in community-led innovation, investing in the solutions that communities themselves have come up with, and scaling that up. And so that is a disservice, not only to Black communities, but to all of us. Because I think, when we think about the ecosystem we're all playing in, we need to ensure that everyone is able to reach their full potential. So I think even tracking numbers like that would be helpful and supportive of the goals that we're all kind of endeavoring towards. And that's why I think this piece, and kind of continuing on the bandwagon of giving props to Brookfield and giving props to this inclusive innovation monitor, I think Danny's absolutely right. Oftentimes there is a siloing of these two worlds that needs to come together. And I think the pandemic has demonstrated how crucial that is, because unfortunately, it's mathematically impossible for us to have an economic recovery if we don't include women workers, if we don't include racialized workers. We need all hands on deck. And I think data is one piece of the puzzle, but it's also actually using that data to inform decision making. I think that's another piece of this as well.
What other perspectives, I'm curious to, this is open to all panelists, do you think, what are we missing right now in terms of our decision-making capabilities, in terms of either data collection or simply perspectives that are left out? What are we missing in order to be able to really be pushing towards a more inclusive innovation and more broadly an inclusive recovery from COVID-19?
So let's start. I see Daniel already doing this. But let's start with the fact we don't really have an innovation policy in this country. More importantly, and I think especially if you want inclusive innovation, we tend to work on both of them budget by budget. So when the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance think it's a good idea to talk politically about inclusion, we'll have an inclusiver budget. When it's cool to talk about innovation, we'll have innovation budget. That's great. But that's not how you solve those two issues. Those two issues take a lot of time to solve. So if you want to solve them, you need to institutionalize the public service, civil service, public agencies, NGO that actually deal with them. And we have done a horrible job of doing that. And even when we create things that sounds as if they should deal with that, so Anjum reminded us all about the Strategic Innovation Fund. I would task you to see where they put their money. And the realization is that up to 60 or 70% of it has nothing to do with strategy and nothing to do with innovation. It is to the two sectors that had problems at the time before COVID, which was the oil sector and the automobile production sector. It has nothing to do with innovation, nothing to do with inclusion. And it's just one example of how we are failing our own people here. If we want to do something about it, we need to systemize it, institutionalize it, and take care of it year after year for a long period of time. We have not done it for at least 20 years.
Josh, can I add just one quick thing?
Yeah.
As Danny says, as Danny puts it, we don't have an innovation policy, and so he's covered that off. I think on the inclusive side of things, I think there's a pretty robust conversation in Canada about inclusion. I'm not convinced that that conversation is leading to sort of, really substantial change in inclusion. I mean, there's a concern, and I think it's well-founded, that a lot of the talk about inclusion is performative and not substantive. So there's that. But even more so is that even our conversations about inclusion really don't like to deal with the other two tricky dimensions, which is distribution. So who has the resources to participate, and how are those resources, or how are the benefits distributed, once innovation has occurred, once economic growth has occurred. And what are we doing to actually empower people in organizations and decision-making bodies around innovation, right? We can meet a number of quotas, according to whichever characteristics you want to meet, whether it's gender quotas, racialized people, and you can have those people in the organizations. But if they're not empowered to actually make decisions to contribute to innovation, it's just performative inclusion. So, to add to, we don't have an innovation policy, I'd say we don't have, a fully robust, inclusive discourse or policy.
And that's actually a great transition to the first audience question that I've had roll in. And apologies, as it looks like I'm just reading a text off my phone, but that is how I'm getting the audience questions. The first one is, would it be fair to say that opportunities for innovation must begin with inclusion itself? The Feminist Recovery Plan, co-authored by Anjum, and Daniel's definition approach suggests that the answer is yes, that innovation must begin with inclusion itself. But Danny's and Sue's approach suggests that the answer may be no, since inclusion may be tantamount to including more people in increasingly outdated systems, especially in manufacturing. So can these 2 points of view, if they're right, be reconciled somehow?
So I guess I would say yes, and thanks to Anita, old friend, for that really thought-provoking question. I guess I think that there's a concept of non-reformist reform. Can you actually use existing systems to make the system itself better? And I guess I think maybe two ways of doing that. One is the idea of paid leave. So let's recognize that non-market work is important, and it should not in all cases be replaced by market work. There's a benefit to people caring for their own children rather than putting that in the market or cooking their own food. And so let's allow time for that. And then the second thing I think is the kinds of access to data that I mentioned in the manufacturing factory floor context, but also occur in other areas as well. So if you think about stores bringing in handheld computers, and in some stores there's a view that you want these computers or little iPads to be very low functionality so that you can roll them out quickly to a high turnover workforce. Another view, there's a family-owned chain in Cleveland where I live, Heinen's, that wants a long tenure workforce. They want to have everybody thinking about stocking and being able to help customers and stuff. And so they have much more detailed information available to workers. And so that's a kind of way that, and there's, surprising things that come up when you allow everybody access to this data. So you could imagine the system itself changing as a result of the processes we put in place.
So let me add to that. And I think it's important to understand that there's many different kinds of innovation. So if you think about Daniel's definition, the definition we all use, there is innovation of coming up with completely new products and technologies. And then there is innovation of how to make those products much better, which, by the way, are much more important to our welfare than the first invention. And then there's innovation in services, innovation in aftermarket, innovation in the organization of a work. All those kinds of innovation necessitate different skills and different channels. So depending on where you want to focus your innovation, you need to include different people. And an example that we have from our research, and we will find fascinating, is a different way that unions are being included in decision about national level innovation policy. So in Sweden, not that surprisingly, they are part of the discussions. And that also changed how union then behaved toward new innovation. They assume, and correctly so, because they are there also with the government and the employee, that the main idea of this innovation policy is to at least have the same numbers of job, preferably higher, otherwise Swedish manufacturer will lose out. And second, that those jobs will be much better and more interesting. So they are completely for innovation. The cost of that is that you focus much more of your national public R&D on the kind of innovation that union workers care about in manufacturing, instead of coming up with completely new idea for Apple apps. A second issue, and here I want to even go further than Sue. A good friend of mine did his work on looking at how retail organization using exactly the same software, reaching exactly the same profit margin, use it to either empower their suppliers and workers or control everything. Walmart is the one that control everything and assume that its workers are badly paid. And it's not just Walmart. Target is even worse. We Canadians don't have to worry about it because Target left, but Target is even worse than Walmart. You go to places like Germany and Denmark, exactly the same software systems. They assume the workers will stay for a long period of time. They assume the shopping experience is much better if you have workers that are educated and know about the store. And they use the same software, just like Sue described, to empower both the workers and their suppliers so the supplier can come up with new products. The end result, which I think is what's fascinating, is that their profit margin are more or less the same. And if you look at the past, everybody thought that Walmart will kick out, every other retailer on earth. They actually have been finding it very difficult to operate in areas and systems that don't look like the United States.
All right, so we've only got about 6 or 7 minutes left. I'm going to try to get through a couple more audience questions before we go. The next one is human capital is essential for any improvement of productivity and innovation. Why do we not judge innovations and policies on how much they improve human capital and if anyone is excluded? Danny, do you want to go again? What about Daniel? All right.
I mean, I guess in part it's a funny question because I guess I might say that implicitly we do if we don't always explicitly do that, right? That is, that we use a number of different technologies in the development. I'm assuming there's a question about the development of human capital. We use a number of technologies in the development of human capital, and so the test of whether or not those technologies are contributing is to look at the nature of the human capital. And just looking at, in the Canadian case, we don't, we have some skills, some specific skills issues, but in terms of sort of overall education, we don't really have, serious issues with our overall education performance. But if the concern is whether or not we should do a more explicit assessment of the effects of technology on human capital, I think that's probably fair, both in the development of it and both in terms of sort of the effects on workers that Sue was talking about earlier.
Okay, all right, and I think we got time for one more question, and I think it's a broad one. So, what needs to change now that can help with an inclusive recovery, and what countries should we be learning from? I know, Danny, you were mentioning in particular certain countries that were perhaps bringing in unions into decision-making around innovation policy. I'm curious if you have any understanding of that.
That's one option. So I think there's several models of countries that are very equal. So while everybody talks about Sweden and Denmark and the Nordics and maybe Germany, I would like to mention Taiwan. So Taiwan was really poor, really agriculture, really not a democracy. It is now a thriving economy, much more equal than ever before, highly innovative and highly democratic. Also, if we think about COVID and the recovery from COVID, it's more or less the one country in the world that never, even for a day, shut down anything, including schools. Understanding how this pandemic works, not only they then moved production to make sure they have PPE in advance, they then distributed completely equally by days, made sure everyone had access. And when they told people that they have to stay home because they have COVID, they made sure that food arrives so nobody has to go out of the house or in contact with them, and you don't have to worry that you starve when the country like Canada said, hey, Daniel, you're now stuck at home for 2 weeks. Good luck with the food. That's a country we should strive to, and it's a model that we hardly look at. So I would urge us not just to look again and again and again to the same models, but I would urge many policymakers in Canada to do a tour of Taiwan.
Yeah, just to kind of contribute to this question, I think, I'm struck by the fact that often when we think about innovation, it's around indicators of success. So, how many jobs were created? What was the value proposition, if you will? But I think we need to also be tracking indicators of barriers. So, even in this, kind of period of economic recovery, yes, please, let's look at GDP numbers, let's look at employment numbers, but I would argue what is stemming innovation is when people don't have access to basic needs. So, homelessness, is that something that we're tracking and also making the connections to innovation? Similarly, gender based violence. So, this past weekend, December 6th, is the National Remembrance on Gender Based Violence. And it commemorates, a tragedy in this country where women were killed because they were studying engineering, right? And so those barriers to, those sectors of innovation, there is a lot, the social environments that we live in. So I think we need to also absolutely let's look at indicators of success, but also be tracking with great vigor indicators of barriers, because that is also something that will be important to address the innovation gap.
Thank you so much, Evan. That's a great note to leave off on. We're approaching 11 o'clock, so I think we're going to wind it down from here. But I want to thank everyone, all of our panelists, for taking part today. Thank you so much, Danny. Thanks, Anjum. Thanks, Daniel. And thank you, Sue. Thank you as well to the Monk School and CFAR for putting this event on today. I hope all of the participants learned a little bit today and had an enjoyable morning. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to the next panel. Thanks, everybody.